The champagne glass shattered against the marble floor like a gunshot. Zeynep Adebila's white wedding gown caught the light as her new husband leaned in close, his breath hot against her ear. To the crowd of elite criminals watching their first dance, it looked like an intimate whisper between newlyweds. But the words Jung Tae-hyun spoke were anything but romantic. "Your accounts are already empty, darling. Sign the documents, or tonight will be your last." The ballroom fell silent. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead, casting shadows across faces that understood this wasn't a celebration. It was a hostile takeover. Every guest in their designer suits and evening gowns knew exactly what kind of wedding they were attending. This was business. And business in Jung Tae-hyun's world was always brutal. But what the groom didn't know was that the quiet woman trembling in his arms wasn't the helpless heiress he thought he'd married. She was the most dangerous mistake he would ever make. Stay with me until the end because this story will leave you speechless. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to Mafia Moonlight Tales, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Now let's get into it. It's a warm Saturday evening in Seoul, South Korea, 2024. The Sapphire Tower, a gleaming skyscraper of glass and steel, dominates the skyline. Its penthouse ballroom is reserved exclusively for those who operate in the shadows, the kind of people whose wealth comes with blood on the balance sheets. Tonight, the 88th floor belongs to Jung Tae-hyun. At 38 years old, Tae-hyun had built an empire that made other criminals look like amateurs. His organization controlled digital currency flows across 5 countries. Money laundering, crypto theft, corporate espionage, if it could be monetized, Tae-hyun had his hands in it. His dark eyes scanned numbers the way a shark scans for blood in water. His tailored navy suit, sharp jawline, and calculated smile made him look like a tech entrepreneur. But everyone in this room knew better. Jung Tae-hyun wasn't a businessman. He was a predator. And tonight was supposed to be his greatest acquisition yet. The wedding decor was minimalist perfection. White roses arranged in geometric patterns, ambient lighting that shifted between soft gold and cold blue, and in the background, massive digital screens displaying financial data streams in glowing green code. To anyone unfamiliar with Tae-hyun's world, it might have seemed like an odd choice for a wedding. But this wasn't about romance. This was a transaction. Tae-hyun stood at the center of it all, champagne flute in hand, surveying his kingdom. His groomsmen weren't friends, they were lieutenants. Each one controlled a different arm of his criminal network. The guests weren't family. They were associates, competitors, and potential threats, all gathered to witness his latest power move. Because tonight, Jung Tae-hyun was marrying money. Lots of it. Across the room stood his bride. Zeynep Adebila was a vision in white silk. At 35, she carried herself with a kind of quiet elegance that made people underestimate her. Her dark skin glowed against the ivory gown. Her hair was styled in intricate braids that fell gracefully down her back. She held a bouquet of white roses and eucalyptus, her expression serene, almost detached. To everyone watching, she looked like exactly what Tae-hyun had told them she was, a wealthy, naive African heiress. A woman who had inherited a digital fortune from her late father's tech empire. A woman too trusting, too soft, too quiet to protect herself from men like him. Tae-hyun had spent 6 months researching her. He'd tracked her movements, studied her finances, analyzed every transaction. On paper, Zeynep Adebila was perfect. $847 million in cryptocurrency and digital assets, minimal family connections, and a personality so reserved she barely existed on social media. She was, in his estimation, easy prey. What Tae-hyun didn't know, what his expensive intelligence networks and hired investigators had completely missed, was that Zeynep Adebila's quiet nature wasn't shyness. It was control. You see, before Zeynep had become the elegant woman standing in that white gown, she had been someone else entirely. Someone with a different name, a different life, and a very different skill set. She had been the Wraith. For 12 years, Zeynep had operated in the darkest corners of international espionage. Governments didn't acknowledge her existence. Criminal organizations whispered her codename in fear. She had eliminated targets in 17 countries, dismantled terror cells, and walked away from situations that should have killed her 100 times over. But Zainab had grown tired of the violence, tired of the blood, tired of being a ghost. So 5 years ago she'd made a choice. She'd disappeared, taken her accumulated wealth, created a new identity, and tried to build the one thing her previous life had never allowed her: peace. She'd wanted to believe that someone could love her for who she was now, not what she'd been. When she met Taehyun at a charity gala in Lagos, she'd seen a successful, charming businessman. She'd ignored the whispers, the red flags, the instincts that had kept her alive for over a decade. She'd wanted to be wrong about him. But standing here now, in this ballroom full of criminals, watching the cold green numbers flash across the screens behind her, Zainab knew the truth. She'd married a monster. And monsters, as she had learned long ago, only understood one language. The music swelled. Taehyun extended his hand with that practiced smile, and they moved onto the dance floor for their first dance as husband and wife. The crowd watched with polite applause. Phones were discreetly recording. This moment would be shared across encrypted channels, proof that young Taehyun had successfully trapped another fortune. As they swayed to the music, Taehyun pulled her closer. His lips brushed her ear, and that's when he dropped the mask completely. "I've already drained the Singapore account, darling. 400 million. The rest will follow tonight." Zainab's hand tightened on his shoulder, but her face remained calm. "The lawyers are waiting in the conference room," he continued, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "You'll sign the power of attorney, transfer everything, and then, well, let's just say you won't be needing those assets where you're going." His fingers pressed into her waist, hard enough to bruise. "You really thought someone like me would marry someone like you for love?" The champagne glass slipped from Zainab's other hand. It fell in slow motion, crystal catching the light as it tumbled toward the marble floor. And when it shattered, something else shattered too. The last remnants of the woman who'd believed in second chances. The last fragments of the peaceful life she'd tried to build. The final pieces of the mask she'd worn for 5 long years. Zainab's eyes lifted to meet Taehyun's. And for the first time since he'd met her, he saw something in those dark depths that made his instincts scream a warning he was already too late to heed. She smiled. Not the gentle, demure smile he'd grown accustomed to. This smile was cold, surgical. The smile of someone who'd just made a very final decision. "You have no idea who you just married," she whispered back. And in the shards of broken crystal scattered across the marble floor, Taehyun caught a glimpse of something that turned his blood to ice. A reflection, not of the trembling bride in white, but of a woman in black tactical gear, eyes hard as diamonds, hand resting on a weapon that shouldn't exist at a wedding. Young Taehyun had built his empire on one fundamental principle: identify weakness and exploit it without mercy. But tonight, he would learn what happens when the predator mistakes a sleeping lion for prey. Because Zainab Adebula wasn't weak. She'd just been waiting. And now the waiting was over. The Sapphire Towers penthouse had cost young Taehyun $3 million to rent for the evening. Every detail had been orchestrated to project one message: absolute power. Ice sculptures shaped like dragons melted slowly in the corners, their translucent forms catching the light from the chandeliers above. Servers in crisp white uniforms moved silently through the crowd, offering champagne that cost more per bottle than most people earned in a month. The digital screens that lined the walls weren't just decoration, they were a statement. Real-time cryptocurrency markets, stock tickers, transaction flows from Hong Kong to London to New York. This was Taehyun's world, and he wanted everyone to see it. The guest list read like a directory of international crime. There was Park Min-jae, who controlled the shipping lanes between Busan and Shanghai. Beside him stood Catherine Volkov, whose art galleries in Moscow laundered money for half of Eastern Europe's elite. In the corner, nursing expensive whiskey, was Rahman al-Sayed, a man whose legitimate oil business barely concealed his less legitimate arms trading. These weren't people who attended weddings for sentiment. They were here to observe a transaction, to witness Taehyun's latest conquest, and to recalibrate their understanding of his growing influence. And Taehyun loved every second of it. He worked the room with practiced ease, his hand occasionally resting on Zainab's lower back as he introduced her to his associates. "My beautiful bride," he would say, the words dripping with a possessiveness that made several guests exchange knowing glances. "She's brought quite the dowry to our union." Polite laughter followed each introduction. These people understood the subtext. Marriage in their world was rarely about love. It was about assets, alliances, and leverage. Zainab played her part perfectly. She smiled graciously, spoke softly when addressed, and maintained the exact demeanor Taehyun had expected from her. Quiet, compliant, overwhelmed by the opulence surrounding her. What he didn't notice was how her eyes tracked every exit, every security guard, every potential weapon disguised as decor. He didn't catch the way her breathing remained perfectly controlled even as he squeezed her hand too tightly. He was too busy congratulating himself on his own genius. "She's perfect," he'd told his second-in-command, Choi Sung-min, earlier that evening. Docile, isolated, and so desperate for affection she didn't even question the prenup. Sung-min had nodded approvingly. "When do we move the assets?" "Tonight. Once the ceremony is done and everyone's had enough champagne to be distracted, we'll take her to the conference room. I've already had the lawyers prepare everything. She'll sign, we'll transfer, and by morning she'll be..." He'd paused, choosing his words carefully. No longer a concern. The plan was simple, elegant even. Zainab would disappear. An unfortunate accident, perhaps. A bride who couldn't handle the pressures of her new life. By the time anyone thought to ask questions, her fortune would be distributed across so many encrypted wallets and shell corporations that even the best forensic accountants would never trace it back to him. Young Taehyun had executed variations of this scheme a dozen times before. Businessmen who'd trusted him with investments. Partners who'd believed in his promises. Even a politician who'd thought their alliance was based on mutual respect. Each time he'd walked away richer while they walked away with nothing. Or didn't walk away at all. This was his gift, the ability to identify exactly what people wanted to believe about him, and then become that illusion just long enough to destroy them. As the evening progressed and the first dance approached, Taehyun felt the familiar rush of victory. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. The trap had closed. The asset was secured. He raised his champagne glass, catching Zainab's eye across the room. She raised hers in return, that gentle smile still in place. Neither of them knew that in less than an hour, one of them would be running for their life. And it wouldn't be the woman in the white dress. Zainab had chosen the white roses herself. Standing at the altar earlier that evening, bouquet in hand, she'd focused on their delicate petals to keep herself grounded. Each flower had been cut at exactly the right moment, just before full bloom, still holding the promise of something beautiful yet to unfold. That's what she'd wanted this marriage to be. Promise. Beginning. 5 years ago, when she'd walked away from the wraith, she'd made herself a vow. No more violence. No more calculated kills in hotel rooms across 3 continents. No more waking up in cold sweats, seeing the faces of targets who'd begged for mercy she couldn't afford to give. She'd wanted normal. Desperately, achingly normal. Coffee in the morning without checking for poison. Conversations that didn't require analyzing every word for hidden threats. A life where her skills with a blade stayed buried so deep they'd eventually be forgotten. When Taehyun had first approached her at that charity gala in Lagos, she'd recognized the type immediately. Ambitious. Calculating. The kind of man who viewed people as chess pieces. Her instincts had screamed warnings she'd spent 12 years learning to trust. But she'd ignored them, because she'd wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could be the kind of woman someone married for love instead of fear. The kind of woman who didn't have blood permanently stained on her conscience. She'd convinced herself that Taehyun's intensity was passion, not predation. That his questions about her wealth were natural curiosity, not reconnaissance. That his desire to marry quickly was romantic spontaneity, not tactical urgency. God, she'd been so desperate to be wrong about him. Even now, swaying in his arms on the dance floor, part of her had hoped he'd prove her instincts false. That the cold gleam in his eyes was just the lighting. That the tight grip on her waist was affection, not ownership. But then he'd spoken those words. Your accounts are already empty. And the last fragile hope shattered just like the champagne glass now scattered across the marble. Zainab's mind catalogued the betrayal with clinical precision, old habits snapping back into place like muscle memory. He'd accessed the Singapore account. That meant he had her passwords, which meant he'd been surveillance on her for months, not weeks. The lawyers waiting in the conference room suggested premeditation. The threat about where she was going confirmed lethal intent. This wasn't impulse. This was a carefully orchestrated execution, and she was meant to be the corpse. The realization didn't bring anger. Not yet. First came something worse, a grief so profound it threatened to crack through the composure she'd maintained all evening. She'd tried so hard to leave the violence behind. She'd built a new identity, created a quiet life, forced herself to believe that peace was possible for someone with her history. She'd attended farmers' markets and book clubs. She'd learned to bake bread for God's sake. Bread. All of it, every careful step toward normalcy, had been built on a foundation of willful ignorance. An Tae-hyun had destroyed it in a single whispered sentence. The music continued. The crowd watched. And Zainab felt the last pieces of who she'd tried to become dissolve like sugar in acid. She'd wanted to be soft. The world had other plans. Her fingers, still resting on Tae-hyun's shoulder, flexed slightly. The motion was barely perceptible, but her body remembered what her mind had tried to forget. Pressure points, weak spots, the exact angle required to collapse a trachea. 5 years of meditation and therapy. 5 years of convincing herself she was more than her training. 5 years of desperate, exhausting hope. All of it gone. Tae-hyun pulled back slightly, studying her face with that smug satisfaction of a hunter admiring trapped prey. He expected tears, begging, maybe shocked silence. What he got instead was something his research had never prepared him for. Zainab smiled. Not the gentle, uncertain smile of the woman he thought he'd married. This smile belonged to someone else entirely. Someone who'd been sleeping, dormant, waiting. The wraith had always been patient. And she'd just woken up. The music ended. Polite applause rippled through the ballroom. Tae-hyun kept his hand firmly on Zainab's waist as he guided her toward the center of the room, positioning them directly beneath the largest chandelier. He raised his champagne glass, and the crowd quieted immediately. This was the moment they'd been waiting for, the groom's toast. In their world, these speeches were never about love. They were about power, territory, and the subtle art of public dominance. My friends, Tae-hyun began, his voice carrying effortlessly across the penthouse. Thank you for witnessing this beautiful union tonight. Several guests smiled knowingly. Catherine Volkov whispered something to her companion. Park Min-jae checked his watch, calculating how much longer this performance would take. Marriage is about partnership, Tae-hyun continued, his arm sliding possessively around Zainab's shoulders. About two people bringing their their hearts, together. Scattered laughter. Everyone understood the slip was intentional. Zainab stood perfectly still beside him, bouquet still clutched in her hands. To the casual observer, she looked like any overwhelmed bride, perhaps uncomfortable with the attention, maybe finally realizing the mistake she'd made. Tae-hyun's grip tightened. My dear Zainab has been so generous, so trusting. He paused, letting the words hang in the air like a noose. Some might even say, naive. The laughter grew louder. A few guests exchanged glances that confirmed what they'd all suspected. This wasn't a wedding. This was an execution masked as celebration. In fact, Tae-hyun said, pulling a folded document from his jacket pocket with theatrical precision, She's already been generous enough to grant me access to several of her accounts. The Singapore holdings, for instance. 8 figures, transferred just this afternoon. The room went completely silent. This was beyond the usual posturing. This was public humiliation, the kind that sent a message to everyone present. Jung Tae-hyun took what he wanted, and there were no consequences. Zainab's eyes remained fixed on the middle distance, her expression unreadable. "Now, darling," Tae-hyun said, turning to face her directly. "We have just a few more documents that need your signature. Power of attorney, transfer agreements. Simple formalities." He waved toward a door at the far end of the ballroom. "My lawyers are waiting in the conference room. We can handle this quickly and then—" His smile sharpened. "Then we can discuss your future. What little remains of it." Several guests shifted uncomfortably. There was predatory business, and then there was this cruelty so blatant it bordered on reckless. A few wondered if Tae-hyun had finally overplayed his hand, allowed his ego to make him sloppy. 2 bodyguards materialized from the shadows, moving to flank Zainab. They weren't there for protection. They were there to escort her, to ensure compliance, to make certain that if she tried to run or scream, she'd be contained before anyone could intervene. Not that anyone would. In this room, witnessing was acceptable. Interfering was suicide. "Come now," Tae-hyun said, his voice dropping to a tone that mimicked concern while dripping with malice. "Don't be difficult, wife. You wouldn't want to cause a scene at your own wedding, would you?" He gestured toward the conference room again, more forcefully this time. The bodyguards stepped closer. One of them reached for Zainab's arm. The entire ballroom held its breath, waiting to see how the quiet bride would respond to her public destruction. Zainab finally moved. She set down her bouquet on a nearby table with deliberate care, each white rose and eucalyptus stem arranged just so. Then she looked up at her husband, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since the dance had ended. "You're right about one thing," she said, her voice soft but carrying perfectly in the silent room. "I have been naive." Tae-hyun's smile widened. Confession. Surrender. Exactly what he'd expected. "But not about what you think." Her hand moved to her throat, fingers finding the delicate pearl necklace she'd worn for the ceremony. With one smooth motion, she snapped the string. Pearls scattered across the marble floor, each one bouncing with a sound like distant gunfire. And in that moment, every security professional in the room recognized what they were seeing. A woman creating an obstacle field. The first bodyguard's hand never reached her arm. Time seemed to fracture along with the pearls. Zainab watched them scatter across the polished marble, each one rolling in a different direction, creating a constellation of obstacles between her and the men who meant to drag her to her death. The sound they made, that delicate percussion of spheres against stone, triggered something deep in her memory. Another floor. Another life. Casings from a spent magazine, bouncing across concrete in a safe house outside Budapest. She'd been 26 then. The target had been an arms dealer who'd sold chemical weapons to terrorists. The wraith had walked in wearing an evening gown not unlike this wedding dress, and walked out leaving nothing behind but questions and corpses. That woman had known exactly who she was. What she was. Zainab's eyes dropped to the shards of champagne glass still scattered near her feet from moments ago. In one particularly large piece, she caught her reflection. Not the carefully constructed bride who'd spent 5 years pretending to be harmless, but something deeper. Someone who'd never really left. The wraith stared back at her through the broken crystal. For 5 years, she'd convinced herself that person was gone. That the woman who could kill a man in 17 different ways with nothing but a dinner fork had been buried so deep she'd never resurface. She'd meditated, journaled, attended therapy sessions with doctors who had no idea what she was really trying to forget. All of it had been a beautiful lie. Because the truth was simpler and more terrible. You didn't unlearn how to be a weapon. You just chose not to fire. And Jung Tae-hyun, in his infinite arrogance, had just removed her safety. The bodyguard's hand was still reaching for her arm, moving in what he probably thought was quick motion. To Zainab, he might as well have been swimming through honey. She could see the exact moment his fingers would make contact. Another half second. She could read his body language, the tension in his shoulders that telegraphed his intention to grab and control rather than harm. He wasn't expecting resistance. None of them were. That would be their first mistake. Not their last, but definitely their first. Zainab's mind clicked through calculations with the efficiency of a computer running familiar code. 6 bodyguards visible in the immediate area. Probably 8 more stationed throughout the penthouse. 43 guests, most unarmed but some certainly carrying concealed weapons. For exits, 2 of them likely monitored. The conference room Taehyun had mentioned. 3rd door on the left, probably reinforced, definitely locked from the outside once she was inside. The digital screens behind her showed financial markets, but she knew the system they ran on. She'd hacked similar setups in Dubai and Singapore. Give her 90 seconds and admin access, and she could turn Taehyun's pride into his prison. All of this processed in less time than it took for the bodyguard's hand to cross the final inches toward her. She'd spent 5 years building a cage around the monster inside her, convincing herself that peace was possible, that she could be soft without being weak, that love was worth the vulnerability it required. Taehyun had just proven her wrong about all of it. The broken glass at her feet reflected the truth she'd been avoiding. Some people only understood violence. Some situations only had brutal solutions. And some parts of yourself, no matter how deeply you buried them, were always going to be there when you needed them most. The grief would come later. The regret about what she'd lost. The dream of normalcy, the hope for redemption. All of that would hit her eventually. But right now, watching the bodyguard's hand move toward her in slow motion, Zainab made a choice. She stopped pretending. The wraith smiled. And the wedding reception became something else entirely. The bodyguard's hand never reached her arm. Zainab moved with a speed that seemed to violate physics. Her left hand caught his wrist mid-reach, fingers finding the pressure point with surgical precision. Her right hand grabbed one of the scattered champagne flute shards from the floor, the movement so fluid it appeared choreographed. Before anyone in the room could process what was happening, she'd driven the glass into the soft tissue just above his collarbone. Not lethal. Not yet. But the bodyguard dropped to his knees, a strangled gasp escaping his throat as his nervous system from the precise strike. The second bodyguard lunged forward, finally recognizing the threat. His hand went for the gun holstered beneath his jacket. He was too slow. Zainab spun inside his reach, using his own momentum against him. Her elbow connected with his solar plexus. Exact angle, perfect force, and his breath evacuated in a violent wheeze. As he doubled over, she brought her knee up into his face. The crack of cartilage echoed through the silent ballroom. Both men were down in less than 3 seconds. The white wedding gown swirled around her legs as she straightened, small droplets of blood creating abstract patterns on the silk. Her breathing remained perfectly controlled. Not a hair out of place. The transformation was complete. The quiet bride was gone. What stood in her place was something the criminal elite recognized instinctively. An apex predator. Jesus Christ, someone whispered in the crowd. Taehyun stumbled backward, champagne glass slipping from his fingers. His expression cycled through confusion, disbelief, and then something he rarely experienced. Fear. For more bodyguards rushed forward from their positions around the room. They moved in a coordinated pattern, trained professionals who'd dealt with threats before. But they'd never dealt with the wraith. The first one reached for her. Zainab caught his arm, redirected his momentum, and used his own body weight to throw him into the ice sculpture behind her. Dragon and man shattered together in an explosion of crystal and flesh. The second one actually managed to draw his weapon. The gun was halfway up when Zainab's foot connected with his wrist. The weapon skittered across the marble floor, bouncing off scattered pearls. A follow-up strike to his throat sent him gasping to the ground. The third and fourth attack simultaneously. Smart, professional. They'd seen what she could do and adjusted their tactics accordingly. It didn't matter. Zainab ducked under the third guard's swing, her movements economical and precise. She grabbed a champagne bottle from a nearby table without looking, using it to block the fourth guard's punch. Glass shattered, Dom Perignon spraying across designer suits. She drove the broken bottle's neck into the third guard's knee, not deep enough to kill, but deep enough to take him out of the fight. He collapsed with a scream that finally broke the crowd's shocked paralysis. People started backing toward the exits. Screams erupted. Catherine Volkov knocked over an entire table trying to retreat. Park Min-jae pulled out his phone, already calculating how to spin this catastrophe to his advantage. The fourth guard, now alone, hesitated. He'd watched this woman in a wedding dress dismantle 6 trained operatives in under 20 seconds. His hand hovered near his weapon, but the survival instinct that had kept him alive in this business finally overrode his orders. He ran. Zainab let him go. Her dark eyes swept the ballroom, cataloging threats, exits, and the man who'd made the fatal mistake of thinking he could cage a ghost. Taehyun stood frozen near the digital screens, his face drained of color. The confident predator was gone, replaced by something that understood, too late, what it meant to be prey. Zainab took one step toward him, blood-spattered gown trailing behind her. "Now," she said, her voice carrying the weight of 12 years of death. "About those documents you wanted me to sign." 12 years ago, Zainab Adebala hadn't existed. The woman who would eventually take that name had been recruited at 23 by an organization so deeply buried in government bureaucracy that even most intelligence agencies didn't know it existed. They'd found her in Lagos, a university student studying computer engineering with a peculiar talent for disappearing into crowds and an unfortunate habit of defending herself with lethal efficiency when cornered. The recruiter had watched her put 3 armed muggers in the hospital using nothing but her textbooks and improvisation. He'd seen potential where others saw violence. "We can teach you to do that better," he'd said. "Cleaner. For people who actually deserve it." She'd been naive enough to believe him. The training facility had been somewhere in the Scottish Highlands. At least, that's what the landscape suggested during the rare moments they were allowed outside. 18 months of hell designed to break down everything human and rebuild something more useful. Hand-to-hand combat from a former Mossad instructor who'd killed more people than he'd bothered counting. Weapons training with an ex-SAS operative who could field strip a rifle blindfolded. Tactical driving from a woman who'd escaped 3 assassination attempts through pure vehicular improvisation. Hacking and digital infiltration from a ghost who claimed to have brought down a government with nothing but a laptop and patience. But the real education came from understanding psychology. How to read a room in 3 seconds. How to identify the most dangerous person present by their posture alone. How to become whatever the mission required. Seductress, businesswoman, victim, ghost. The Wraith had been born in those 18 months. Her first assignment. A human trafficker operating out of Amsterdam. She'd walked into his club wearing designer heels and left him bleeding out in his office while security cameras mysteriously malfunctioned. The second, a corrupt politician selling state secrets in Prague. He'd thought he was meeting a potential buyer. They'd found him 3 days later. His death ruled a heart attack. The Wraith had already been in Morocco by then. 12 years. 43 confirmed eliminations. Targets across 17 countries who'd all believed themselves untouchable until the moment they weren't. She'd learned to navigate 5-star hotels and maximum security compounds with equal ease. Could blend into a charity gala or a black market arms deal without raising suspicion. She'd killed men twice her size with nothing but a hairpin. Had escaped capture in Cairo by hijacking a delivery truck and driving it through 3 roadblocks. The skills had become instinct. Muscle memory so deeply embedded that even 5 years of forced retirement couldn't completely erase them. Now, standing in this ballroom surrounded by criminals who thought they were dangerous, those instincts were flooding back with crystalline clarity. She could see the weight distribution that told her which guests were armed. Could identify the security cameras positioned in every corner. 12 total, all networked, all vulnerable to the right malware. The digital screens behind her weren't just displaying financial data. They were connected to the building's mainframe, which meant access to elevators, locks, and emergency systems. The exits weren't really exits. One led to a service corridor that would be locked from the outside, another to a stairwell that security would funnel her toward. The real escape route was the kitchen, third door past the bar, which connected to a service elevator that bypassed the main security checkpoint. She knew all of this without conscious thought, the same way a concert pianist knew where the keys were without looking. The Wraith had spent 12 years learning to survive in environments designed to kill her. Jung Tae-hyun had just turned his wedding into one of those environments. And Zainab, no, the Wraith had never failed a mission yet. Zainab moved toward the digital screens with measured steps, her blood-stained gown leaving a trail across the marble. The remaining guests pressed themselves against the walls, creating a clear path. No one dared interfere. Tae-hyun finally found his voice. Security. Lock down the building. Get her. I wouldn't, Zainab interrupted, not bothering to turn around. She reached the main control panel beneath the largest screen. Unless you want everyone here to see exactly where all your money actually comes from. Her fingers flew across the interface. The system was high-end, military-grade encryption, biometric locks, redundant firewalls. It would have taken a skilled hacker hours to breach. The Wraith needed 90 seconds. The screens flickered. Financial data streams dissolved into command prompts that scrolled faster than human eyes could follow. Tae-hyun's carefully curated display of wealth transformed into something far more revealing. Account numbers appeared. Transaction histories. Shell corporations in the Caymans linked to assassination contracts. Cryptocurrency wallets tied to human trafficking operations. Money laundering routes that implicated half the people in this room. Stop her! Tae-hyun screamed, his composure completely shattered. Someone fucking stop her! But his remaining security personnel had seen what happened to their colleagues. They stayed frozen, guns drawn but pointed nowhere useful. Zainab's smile never wavered as her fingers continued their dance. She'd infiltrated more secure systems than this in Johannesburg, Taipei, and Moscow. This was almost insulting in its simplicity. Did you know, she said conversationally, pulling up another layer of data, that your entire empire runs through 17 primary accounts? Impressive diversification. Poor security architecture. The screens now displayed something that made several guests gasp. Real-time cryptocurrency transfers. Tae-hyun's holdings moving in rapid succession. Millions flowing out of his control and into addresses that didn't exist 5 minutes ago. What are you doing? Tae-hyun lunged toward her, but stopped when she didn't even flinch. The predator in him recognized that getting within her reach would be suicide. Returning a favor, Zainab replied. You stole my money. I'm redistributing yours. Her fingers paused over one particularly large transaction. This account, the one in Singapore you were so proud of draining. I'm sending it to an organization that rescues trafficking victims. Poetic, don't you think? Another screen lit up with building schematics. Zainab studied them briefly, then executed 3 commands in rapid succession. Every door in the penthouse locked simultaneously. The elevators shut down. Emergency exits sealed with magnetic locks designed to contain threats. Tae-hyun's golden cage had just become a prison, and he was trapped inside with the thing he'd tried to destroy. You can't, the backups, he stammered. Already corrupted, Zainab said. Along with your offshore redundancies, your cold storage wallets, and that account in Dubai you think nobody knows about. She finally turned to face him. I had 5 years to study digital security. What did you think I was doing all that time? Baking bread. Actually, she had been baking bread. But she'd also been maintaining her technical skills, keeping current with encryption protocols, staying sharp. Just in case. The screens showed the brutal mathematics of his destruction. In less than 3 minutes, Jung Tae-hyun had gone from billionaire crime lord to a man watching his empire dissolve in real time. There's a saying in my old profession, Zainab said, watching his face cycle through rage, desperation, and dawning horror. Never trap an assassin unless you're absolutely certain they can't get out. She pulled up the building's communication systems with a final flourish. You weren't certain. You weren't even close. The last of his accounts zeroed out. And Jung Taehyun finally understood what it meant to have nothing left but fear. The ballroom had emptied considerably. Those guests smart enough to recognize a battlefield when they saw one had retreated to the far corners, pressing against locked doors that refused to open. Others had their phones out, frantically calling associates, lawyers, anyone who might extract them from this catastrophe. No one was coming. Zainab had seen to that. Taehyun backed away from her, his polished shoes crunching over broken glass and scattered pearls. The man who'd stood so confidently an hour ago, orchestrating public humiliation with a champagne toast, now looked like what he actually was, a predator who'd finally encountered something higher on the food chain. We can negotiate, he said, hands raised in a placating gesture. Whatever you want. Name your price. Zainab tilted her head, studying him the way a biologist might examine an interesting specimen. You're offering me money. My money that you stole. I'll give it back. All of it. Plus interest. We can part ways. Annulment. You never see me again. You threatened to kill me 20 minutes ago, she said flatly. At my own wedding. In front of 40 witnesses. She took a step forward. Now you want to negotiate. Taehyun's back hit the digital screens. Financial data still scrolled behind him, showing accounts that no longer existed, an empire reduced to zeros and error messages. Please, he whispered. The words sounded foreign in his mouth, like a language he'd never learned to speak. I made a mistake. I didn't know. You didn't know who I was, Zainab finished. That's the problem with men like you, Taehyun. You're so obsessed with what people have that you never bother learning who they are. She was close enough now to see the sweat beading on his forehead, to smell the fear replacing his expensive cologne. This was the moment she'd reached 43 times before. The moment when the target understood their life was measured in seconds, not years. But this time felt different. This wasn't a contract. This wasn't a corrupt politician or terrorist financier who'd made the world objectively worse. This was personal. This was the man who'd taken her hope for redemption and crushed it beneath his heel for profit. I spent 5 years trying to be someone else, she said quietly. 5 years convincing myself I could be normal. That I deserved peace. Her voice hardened. You took that from me. I'm sorry. No, you're not. You're scared. There's a difference. Zainab reached into the folds of her wedding gown, her hand emerging with something that made Taehyun's eyes widen. A knife. Small, perfectly balanced. The kind that hadn't been there during the ceremony. The kind the Wraith had taught herself to conceal anywhere, including in the lining of formal wear. Old habits. Here's what's going to happen, Zainab said, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who'd orchestrated dozens of carefully planned deaths. You're going to tell me where you sent my Singapore account data. Every password, every encryption key, every backup location. Then you're going to transfer what's left of your legitimate businesses to a list of charities I'll provide. The knife caught the light from the chandeliers above. And then, Taehyun's voice cracked. Zainab smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Only the cold mathematics of someone calculating exactly how much mercy a monster deserved. Then I decide if you've earned the privilege of walking out of here alive. She let that sink in. Watched him process the reversal, the absolute loss of control, the understanding that his life now depended entirely on the woman he'd tried to destroy. The thing about executioners, Zainab continued, is that we don't have to pull the trigger. Sometimes the real punishment is letting you live with what you've lost. The knife remained perfectly steady in her hand. So talk, husband. And make it convincing. 40 minutes later, Zainab stood in the penthouse's private dressing room, the white wedding gown pooled at her feet like shed skin. Hyun had talked. Of course he had. Men like him always did when the alternative was a blade finding the space between their ribs. He'd given her every password, every backup location, Every piece of leverage he'd accumulated over a decade of criminal enterprise. She'd verified each one, watching him sweat as she confirmed that his cooperation was genuine. Then she'd done exactly what she'd promised, transferred his legitimate holdings to organizations that actually helped people. Trafficking victims, refugees, women escaping domestic violence. The irony wasn't lost on her. As for Taehyun himself, she'd left him cable-tied to a chair in the conference room he'd prepared for her execution, surrounded by the lawyers who'd been ready to witness her coerced signatures. She'd called the Financial Crimes Division of Interpol from his own phone, providing them with enough evidence to keep him imprisoned for several lifetimes. Death would have been kinder. She'd chosen mercy of a different sort. Now, standing before the mirror, Zainab pulled on clothes she'd hidden in this very room 3 days ago, just in case. The Wraith had always believed in contingency plans. Black tactical pants replaced silk and tulle. A fitted long-sleeve shirt covered the elegant skin the wedding gown had exposed. Boots with reinforced soles that could run or fight with equal efficiency. A lightweight jacket with enough pockets to hold everything she'd need to disappear. She braided her hair into a tight, efficient plait. Removed the delicate makeup that had made her look soft and approachable. Wiped away the last traces of the woman who'd wanted to believe in second chances. The transformation took less than 10 minutes. When she looked in the mirror again, Zainab Adebla, the quiet, naive heiress, was gone. What remained was something leaner, harder, more honest. She pocketed the wedding ring without ceremony. Not as a keepsake but as a reminder. Evidence of the price of hope in a world that punished vulnerability. The penthouse's security systems were still under her control. She unlocked the service elevator, the one that bypassed the main lobby and opened directly into the parking garage. The building's cameras would show nothing but static for the next hour, enough time for her to be 3 cities away. Before leaving, she took one last look at the ballroom through the security feed on her phone. Guests were still trapped inside, some pounding on doors, others sitting in stunned silence. Emergency services would arrive eventually. She'd programmed the locks to release in 90 minutes. Taehyun's empire lay in ruins. His wealth redistributed. His criminal network exposed to law enforcement across 5 countries. The man himself awaited prosecution that would ensure he'd never hurt anyone again. Should have felt like victory. Instead, Zainab felt the weight of what she'd lost. Not the money. She'd always known wealth was just numbers on screens. But the dream of being someone other than a weapon. The hope that violence could stay buried. The belief that she deserved the kind of love that didn't come with betrayal. All of it gone. She stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for the garage. As the doors closed, she caught her reflection one final time in the polished metal. The Wraith stared back, patient and cold. 5 years wasn't enough anyway, she said to her reflection. The elevator descended into darkness, carrying a ghost back to the shadows where she'd always belonged. By the time the doors opened, Zainab Adebla had already ceased to exist. What walked out into the soul night was something else entirely. Something that knew better than to hope. Something that would never make the mistake of trusting again. The wedding was over. The ghost had other business to attend to. 6 months after the wedding that became a battlefield, the story had already transformed into legend. In the underground circles where criminals conducted business over encrypted channels and coded language, people still spoke about the night Jung Taehyun's empire collapsed. The details varied depending on who was telling it. Some claimed the bride had been a government agent, others swore she was a rival syndicate's plant. A few insisted the whole thing had been an elaborate insurance fraud. But everyone agreed on one truth. Taehyun had made the fatal mistake of mistaking silence for weakness. He sat now in a maximum security facility outside Seoul, awaiting trial on 63 counts of financial crimes, money laundering and conspiracy. His lawyers had abandoned him when they'd realized his assets were gone. Not hidden, not frozen, but genuinely redistributed beyond recovery. The man who'd built an empire on exploiting others now had nothing but time to contemplate his miscalculation. In his cell, late at night when sleep refused to come, Taehyun would replay that wedding over and over, searching for the signs he'd missed. The moments when he could have recognized what his bride actually was. They'd been there all along. Her posture, too controlled for someone truly nervous. The way her eyes tracked movement with predatory precision. The calm she'd maintained even when he'd threatened her life. Every red flag he'd ignored because his greed had convinced him he was the smartest person in the room. That was the thing about greed. It didn't just corrupt, it blinded. He'd been so focused on what Zainab had, the accounts, the assets, the quantifiable wealth, that he'd never bothered to investigate who she was. His research had been surface level, tactical. He'd learned her bank balances but not her history. He'd studied her finances but not her soul. And that oversight had cost him everything. The criminal underworld had learned from his failure. Now, when syndicates discussed potential targets, due diligence meant something different. Background checks went deeper. Quiet people were approached with more caution. The assumption that silence equaled weakness had died in that penthouse ballroom along with Taehyun's empire. Because the truth was this. The most dangerous people were often the ones who had nothing left to prove. Zainab, or whatever name she used now, had wanted peace. She'd buried her past, suppressed her skills, and genuinely tried to build something normal. That wasn't weakness. That was the kind of strength that came from choosing restraint over reaction, from deliberately sheathing a blade you knew how to use. Taehyun had mistaken that choice for inability. He'd seen a quiet woman and assumed she was quiet because she had no other option. He'd interpreted her desire for connection as desperation. He'd read her hope for redemption as naivety. Every assumption had been wrong. The moral wasn't complicated. True power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to dominate every room or prove its worth through displays of cruelty. Real strength often looks like patience, like control, like someone who could destroy you but chooses not to. Until you give them a reason. Greed makes predators sloppy. It convinces them that everything has a price, that everyone can be bought or broken, that power is measured only in what you can take from others. It creates blind spots large enough to miss the warrior standing right in front of you. Taehyun had hunted what he thought was prey. He'd caught a ghost instead. Now, in his cell, he had decades to contemplate the difference. To understand that the woman in the white wedding gown hadn't been a victim waiting to be exploited. She'd been a retired executioner trying to escape her past. And he'd dragged her right back into it. Somewhere in the world, the wraith moved through shadows, carrying the weight of abandoned hope and renewed purpose. She tried to be something else. The world had reminded her what she was. The price of that reminder had been young Taehyun's entire existence. Some lessons, it seemed, could only be learned through complete destruction. And some ghosts should never be disturbed.